our program after a brief introduction, which it's my particular pleasure to make. Today's speaker is fellow member and my life partner, Grant Belton, who joined the fellowship on his birthday in May of last year, 2023. Originally from Wyoming, he came to Houston to attend Rice University, where he still works for many years, as you'll hear, at Rice360 and now at the Office of Innovation. He remains active on campus as a mentor for engineering design teams and as an alumnus volunteer in his residential college, Weiss. Despite a nearly insatiable desire for travel, Grant has a pretty happy home life too, filled with love from what? And our best doggo friend, Kunde, who you met a couple times at Blessing of the Animals, and too many hobbies and projects in progress to list. Welcome, Grant.
Hello. As AJ so nicely introduced me, I'm Grant, and until a couple of years ago, I worked for Rice360. Rice360 is an institute for global health at Rice University. It's dedicated to designing technologies for global health, and I can talk for hours about global health, but as I'm trying to fit it into a single service, I'm going to just give a very broad explanation about what I did there, a few vignettes of time I spent, and then a bit about how the efforts of the Institute have evolved over the years. So while Rice360 has worked on projects everywhere from Brazil to Zimbabwe, as well as closer to home in Houston and down in Brownsville, most of my personal experience was centered around hospitals in Malawi. While there, I was based in the city of Blantyre at Queen Elizabeth Central Hospital, that I'll be referring to occasionally as QECH, as it is a bit of a mouthful. Malawi, for those unfamiliar with it, is a landlocked country in southeastern Africa, located along the Rift Valley. If my hand is Africa, it's about there. And it is about the size and shape of Florida without its panhandle. And it's home to roughly as many people, about 20 million. And there the similarities begin to break down. But it is known as the warm heart of Africa. And I found that to be a very apt description. People there were kind, welcoming, very generous. Unfortunately, the reason that we were there is that Malawi is one of the least economically developed countries in the world. The most recent information that I could find put their annual spending on healthcare in 2020 at just over $32 per person per year. That barely covers the cost of vaccines. Compare that to over $11,000 a year in the US, and between $4,000 to $6,000 a year for most countries in the EU. It's all in US dollars. So they have very limited money to spend. Where best to spend that? After vaccinations, one of the highest impact places to spend healthcare dollars is in maternal and child health. The vastly oversimplified explanation of why that is the case is that by keeping mothers alive and healthy, they are able to raise healthy babies into adults who contribute to the community. It ends up improving the lives of the entire population in a very, very short period of time. And in an interesting turn of events, the more certainty that children will make it to their 5th birthday, which is a good benchmark for making it through childhood, the more certainty that children will make it to their fifth birthday alive, the smaller families tend to be. So, not too surprisingly, if you know that your children are going to survive, you're more likely to have fewer of them. So that's the background. In the fall of 2016, I traveled to Malawi for the first time with a syringe pump that I had spent the previous 3 years designing and building. I was going there to take it through its first clinical trial in a maternity ward. I was also there to learn as much as I could about the realities facing nurses who would be using the equipment I was going to be helping to design. I'd also be talking to technicians who would maintain and repair the devices when they inevitably wore out. And I hoped to get out of the hospital enough to understand the culture and people with whom I, a white kid from Wyoming, had never really had any contact with beyond watching some National Geographic specials. I did manage all three to varying degrees. So as I arrived at the hospital for the first time, the front entrance could not have been a more apt example of misguided altruism if you had tried. Taking up the majority of the entry hall was a giant set of crates, still sealed, that had been there for several years. Inside them was a donated MRI. It had been delivered along with a cadre of photographers and a delegation from some town in Middle America that had decided to donate their hospital's old MRI to that place where Madonna had adopted a child. All it needed was a few parts to get it running. Obviously, there were some minor details that they didn't bother to check. The hospital already had an MRI that they could use 1 day a week if the power was behaving and if there was a sufficient supply of liquid hydrogen to keep the magnets cool. The new one would have required more liquid hydrogen than was available in the country. Had it run on the 50 hertz power that is present in Malawi, if there had been a building where it could have been turned on safely, and if they had had the spare parts that the hospital in the US had not been able to find. So it sat, still crated, where it had been delivered until apparently, I just learned, in the last year or two, someone finally paid to have it moved out of the way so people could come in the front door of the hospital. So the biggest issue that they faced at the hospital was not actually a lack of donations. It was a lack of equipment that was appropriate to their needs. I was there to learn from them what did and didn't work so I could help design things that would work. Many of the issues they encountered weren't ones that we expected, even though, I was from global health learning and, had attended all of the lectures and had learned all of the details about this. The directors of Rice360, Rebecca Richards-Cordum and Maria Oden, had recently won the MacArthur Genius Award for their work in Malawi, and they had donated the money from that to build a neonatal ICU, intensive care unit, equipped it, and the time I was there, the first time I was there, it was being built. So within a week of its opening, half of the radiant warmers on the ward stopped working. They fried when the generator kicked on to cover a power outage, and the usual 220 volts became 400-something volts for several minutes because the generator wasn't working properly. The massive warehouse of broken equipment was less of a surprise after witnessing that. Thankfully, we were able to order replacements for the controller boards, but if we hadn't been actively involved, they too would have gone there to rust away indefinitely. No replacements were available in country, and there wasn't a budget at the hospital even if there had been. Other examples of that are that windows are left open for temperature control and ventilation all around the hospital. It is sub-Saharan Africa, it's dusty, it's dry. Fine dust got into everything and clogged filters that were designed for air-conditioned, immaculately clean hospitals. And the dust wore down moving parts. and machines that were expected to last for 10 years would be out of service within 6 weeks or 2 or 3 months sometimes. So the technical problems were present, but they were the relatively simple ones to solve. Every ward was understaffed. This was one of 2 central hospitals for the country and comparatively well funded. So for 40 cots in this building that had just been built, those cots were always full. There were usually, but not always, 4 nurses there during the day, fewer at night. So 8 babies per nurse in the intensive care unit. As the reaction from folks would indicate, that's not great. In the US, normal birth wards usually have about 3 babies per nurse, and NICUs typically have a nurse per baby, sometimes 2 nurses per baby. Things as simple as monitoring the baby's temperature was often ignored, just because more urgent things would take their attention. But hypothermia, we studied and discovered, had more influence on a baby's long-term survival than any other metric in that ward. So one of the devices that we developed was a continuous temperature monitor, just a little thermometer that went around the baby's belly, and then it had a light that sat on top of the bassinet. And if the baby was hypothermic, the light would turn blue. If the baby was normothermic, it would be amber, and if they had a fever, it would be red. The lights would indicate the newborn's temperature at a glance from across the room. It also had much more detailed displays showing more information about it, but that was the simple, elegant little solution that reduced the workload of the nurses to a point where they would be able to recognize and acknowledge and deal with just sort of basic needs. So that's not a thing that you need in a temperature-controlled hospital here in Houston with adequate numbers of people. But that is an example of one of the things we had. So 2 things became apparent as I was there. Equipment became broken and wasn't able to be repaired. And there was such a mishmash of donated things that worked in slightly different ways that sometimes perfectly functional devices would be ignored because no one on staff at the time knew how to use it. Add to that proprietary components and consumables, an overburdened workforce, starting at the nurses, but extending all throughout the entire structure of the hospital. And it was a testament to how hard everyone worked that the care that patients received was as good as it was. And it was really amazingly good care for as overburdened as these nurses were. There needed to be far more robust healthcare. There needed to be a far more robust healthcare system, not just more durable equipment. And I was hardly the first person to notice this, but Rice360 at that time was in the right place at the right time, and an opportunity came up in late 2016 to be in the first round of the MacArthur Foundation's bigger version of their grants, called 100 and Change. It was a competition for $100 million to tackle the world's biggest problems. It was a one-time grant, and it was supposed to make meaningful progress on that. The 8 of us, plus a couple of graduate students who made up the entirety of Rice360 at the time, formed a coalition with a number of other groups, both within Africa, 18 different universities, and around the world. Things like the London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, or Medicine, Hygiene and Medicine, sorry, one of those going off the top of my head. And the Kellogg School of Management and UNICEF and the World Health Organization. So a lot of people interested in getting this happening. So we spent a year working our way through the stages. There were 2,000 proposals at first, then 800, then 8, then 4. We didn't actually win the competition. Ultimately, we placed second to Sesame Street, programming cultural elements for Syrian refugees. But that visibility ended up getting us access to groups like the Gates Foundation, who were willing to fund us. And after about another year of fundraising, our now larger group, thankfully, managed to raise about $75 million for a 4-year program. So a very good showing. That funding went to our coalition, now called Nest360, which stood for Newborn Essential Solutions and Technologies. That coalition has several paths to reducing newborn mortality. First, in addition to developing devices, we established a set of guidelines for the 19 essential technologies that we had identified for the care of small and sick newborns. Those documents are now distributed by the World Health Organization, so we handed them off to a big global organization that is recognized as being, understandably, a good source of information about global health. So they're distributed by the World Health Organization to provide standards for anyone seeking either to buy equipment for their hospital or to companies wanting to build new devices for the market. It also allows countries who are seeking funding from places like the World Bank to be able to say, we want to buy these things. They're shown to work. Here's how this is going to work. These things are not a waste of money. So it's easier for them to get the money to buy the things, to solve the things. We also tested hundreds of existing devices against those guidelines and gave recommendations for the best. Where there wasn't a good choice, we worked to develop one. So we had undergraduate teams, we had graduate teams, and then we had paid staff and fellows who would be working on these different projects. The second thing that Nest360 did was to develop modern evidence-based training materials for doctors and nurses to learn best practices in care and the uses of the tools that we provided in our solutions package. We also made training for biomedical technicians to maintain and repair those devices. Third, it established an innovation education program to empower local students not only to be able to repair and maintain devices from outside sources, but to come up with solutions within their own community. That included building out maker spaces in universities that often had only offered traditional lectures in big lecture halls, very little hands-on learning, no project-based learning. Frequently, it was the first time that kids had actually gotten a chance to do the things that they had been learning about in books. We hosted design competitions open to anyone in the community. I helped judge the first one in Blantyre, and we had entries ranging from everything from a hand-powered sewage pump to clean out latrines to a text-based maternal health helpline. So across the gamut of different things. Fourth, it also formed an international nonprofit that helps local firms deal with the hurdles of international distribution, supply chain, product support, and repair. So local repair groups, local things, but they do need help figuring out how to import things and how to deal with all of the supply chain logistics. Setting up that involved a tremendous amount of political and bureaucratic maneuvering for each country, a thing that I am very glad there are others who want to do. So Nest360's goals went really amazingly well, and even with, and partially because of, the slight change in plans that had to happen halfway through the program in 2020, it achieved all of its goals and the addition of the goals surrounding COVID. We went from a limited number of in-person classes to functionally unlimited classes available on Zoom, taught over Zoom. As of this talk, Rice360 partner institutions will have reached over 100,000 newborn admissions in the last 4 years. 22 hospitals in 4 countries are participating. Nearly 10,000 students and clinical staff have taken part in the educational programming, and 1,500 biomedical technicians have gone to in-person trainings. 18 projects from the innovation programs are in various stages of development as well. Rice360 recently, as of like 2 weeks ago, announced that they've been awarded another round of funding from the likes of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and a company, a group called ELMA, which is a big player in the African global health community, for another 4 years to continue building out the program across more of Africa, primarily focusing in sub-Saharan Africa. While I'm no longer working directly for Rice360, I continue to support them both as part of my job at the Rice's new Office of Innovation and personally because I still care quite a bit about this whole ideal. I am forever grateful for the opportunity to have been a small part of a project that is having such a huge impact on the lives of so many people. Thank you.